Thank you all for joining us at SICSS-Howard Mathematica. This complimentary panel discussion entitled Reimagining Social Institutions, Higher Education is available thanks to the generosity of the Social Science Research Council, SSRC, and SAGE Publishing.
Thank you all for being here for Reimagining Social Institutions, which is the second in a series of conversations sponsored by the Social Science Research Council and SAGE Publishing. I'm Alondra Nelson, president of the Social Science Research Council. We are a US-based international research nonprofit that works to support research and researchers and to galvanize social research and knowledge for the public good. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here for this second conversation on higher education in particular. So we have been delighted to participate and collaborate in this endeavor with SAGE Publishing. And I would like to invite Ziad Marar, President of Global Publishing at SAGE, to make a few remarks.
Thank you, Alondra. I hope I'm audible. So yes, as you said, welcome to our second discussion in this Reimagining Social Institutions series. And I'm president of Global Publishing at SAGE. I've been at SAGE for about 30 years. And in that time, have really felt so strongly that SAGE's DNA is engaged with a social science imagination. And I can feel that in the conversations that Alondra and I had, and our colleagues, Katie, Metzer, and others, at both SSRC and SAGE, it became very obvious how that common interest in the importance of a social science imagination was more valuable now than ever before. I wrote a piece recently on what a social science imagination offers us. And for me, I guess what it boils down to is the fact that instead of a tendency to an atomized and individualized way of understanding human behavior, what social science can often do is reset that in the context of understanding history, understanding power, and of course, understanding the kind of institutional forces that are in play that drive outcomes for individuals. And similarly, a social science imagination invites us not to take the status quo as we find it, but to see it more as constructed and therefore changeable in some way. And so it feels to us, I think, that a social science imagination countering these tendencies is doing incredibly valuable work in terms of, in many domains, to push along on progressive agendas, and yet somehow we haven't gone far enough. And of the various domains, probably none is more significant than the appalling fact of racism, which continues to disfigure and scar our society and our culture to such an extraordinary degree, to have such repeated disappointments, to be reminded that so much more needs to be done, invites a second question for social science, which is not just to imagine and understand and explain, but also to, as a call for arms that was a gauntlet laid down by Alondra back in the summer, to actually go beyond that and to look to actually change, to actually think harder. And what a good way to do that would be to actually look at the nature of social institutions, to understand that change comes by applying that social science imagination to contexts. And so I'm delighted that this conversation has continued. The first one was fascinating on schools. I can't wait for a conversation about higher education. SAGE is an academic publisher, so deeply embedded in the higher education environment, and there's so much work to be done. So I'm delighted that we've got such a fascinating range of speakers and cannot wait to have this conversation unfold. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziad, for those remarks and for this partnership. I mean, so much of our conversation when we were thinking about this in the summer, as you said, was, I think about our mutual dissatisfaction from where we sit in the kind of ecosystem of social research and social science with, our work being, importantly descriptive and also often importantly diagnostic, but like really not I think being brave enough often to move into the next step, which is sort of how do we change things? And, so here we are, scholars who are experts in analyzing social institutions. And for us, this is an opportunity to have, I think, a really important conversation about what it takes to make social institutions more just, anti-racist, more inclusive, and just, better working for the people who are parts of them. So for our part, you know, at the Social Science Research Council, we started in April a kind of virtual research center on COVID-19 and the social sciences. And that allowed us to engage a lot of colleagues in our community around, you know, how they were thinking about this moment variously. And, you know, we heard from Naila Swad Nasir, who's the president of the Spencer Foundation, who really charged us with, and I'm quoting her here, needing a social science to step into the creative, innovative work of reimagining social institutions, close quote. And the anthropologist Annalise Riles, who's Associate Provost for Global Affairs at Northwestern University, also in the United States, threw this gauntlet down for us. She said, I think it's really important that universities grasp the historic nature of this crisis. For her, it was both the public health crisis and the crisis and racial justice and racial injustice issues, and open themselves up to reimagining themselves. And the only thing that would really stand in the way of us not doing that is understanding how much around us is changing, and that this change has, you know, and how this change has happened. So really taking up this sort of cri de coeur and this really important mandate, we want to bring together in a series of conversations, this is the second of what we hope will be several more, to really focus on the question of how do we bring our expertise to bear on, again, making stronger, more just and inclusive institutions. So today we're focusing on higher education, a space where many of us, certainly on this panel, sit. But that is facing kind of particular acute stresses in this moment. Most immediately, you know, we saw the stress around sort of how do we continue to teach in colleges and universities all around the world when people are being told, asked, and in some instances mandated to shelter in place, and sort of the immediate crisis of what that's meant. But there's been crises that have been building in the social institution of colleges and universities. Inequality among students and among faculty, racism and you know, inequality in the ways that people are treated in institutions, rising student debt, threats to academic freedom, budget crises and budget cuts that make you know, it hard for institutions to thrive. The changing demographic of who now, you know, who now are members of college faculty and members of the student body. And all of these things are sort of at play at once and really offer us not only the sort of mandate, but also the opportunity to think about how we do our work and how we want to imagine the future of higher education. So we've brought together this incredible, distinguished, and I think, you know, multi-sector group of colleagues from different perspectives to help us think about the question and to think freely and as sort of aspirationally as they would to think about the question of how they would approach or offer an idea or ideas for reimagining higher education. So we're going to hear from the speakers in alphabetical order, and I will introduce them briefly before swiftly turning things over to them. Richard Arum is Dean of the School of Education and Professor of Education and, by courtesy, Sociology, Criminology, Law, and Society at the University of California at Irvine. He served as Director of the Education Research Program at the Social Science Research Council from 2006 to 2013, where he oversaw the development of the Research Alliance for New York City Schools. He is author of an editor of many books and articles. I want to mention a few of his books, Judging School Discipline, A Crisis of Moral Authority, and also co-author of Aspiring Adults Adrift, Tentative Transitions of College Graduates, and Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses, as well as I said, many other publications on student achievement and higher education. Charde Davis is Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Connecticut. Her research examines the way Black women leverage communication in the SICSS circle to invoke collective identity, erect and fortify the boundaries around their home place, and backfill the necessary resources to return to white male-dominant spaces in American society, including colleges and universities. These ideas have been published in over 30 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Her research has been recognized with fellowships from the American Association of University Women and from the Ford Foundation. Earlier this year, with a colleague, Dr. Davis initiated the Black in the Ivory hashtag that galvanized discussion of the experiences of Black faculty and students in the academy. In addition to her academic pursuits, Dr. Davis volunteers her time to organizations and nonprofits that support the overall livelihood of Black women and other people of color and the greater Hartford, Connecticut community in the US. Ilyas Nagdi is Race Equality Project Manager at the University of Sussex and former representative of the 1.5 million students of color and higher education in the UK. He has campaigned on issues around racial equity in education, including the gap in awarding grants and fellowships by race and ethnicity, as well as issues of institutional racism and the drive to decolonize the university. He has been published widely in the mainstream press, including in The Guardian and The Independent, among other media outlets, as well as in scholarly publications such as the International Handbook on Islamophobia and in Doing Equity and Diversity in Higher Education, Redressing Structural Inequalities in the Academy. He is a graduate of the University of Manchester, where he received several awards in recognition of his work widening access to higher education and community engagement. Noliwe Brooks is the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor at Cornell University, where she directs the American Studies program and is a professor in the Africana Studies Department. An interdisciplinary scholar whose research on race and gender in the United States engages legal studies, media studies, sociology, political science, and history, among other fields. She is the author of 4 books, editor of 4 collections as well. She has broad knowledge about the making and unmaking of public education, and her current research is on school choice initiatives, integration, segregation, and online philanthropic support and funding for schools. Thank you all so much for being here. We look forward to hearing your reimaginations of higher education, starting first with Dean Arum.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be part of this panel and participate in this critically important conversation about cultivating equitable, anti-racist social institutions and in higher education in particular. And I wanted to reiterate Alondra's introduction that this is a moment of incredible opportunity and challenge facing higher education. It's an opportunity because there's discussions like this occurring throughout higher education about how to reimagine our institutions to make them more equitable, just places. And it's really heartening to see these discussions occurring throughout the sector. It is, of course, also an extraordinarily challenging moment because higher education institutions themselves are in an extraordinary precarious position right now. And they're in a precarious position because of a set of structural conditions. One, a over-reliance on a financially unsustainable residential model in the US, where higher education costs twice as much per student as it does in Europe. It's also our institutions are in a precarious position because public institutions are reliant on state support, and state governments have diminishing capacity to support them, while we need our institutions to do so much more in meeting the demands for higher education in the 21st century. And third, where these institutions are particularly precarious right now because there is dramatically diminishing public support for them. And that's particularly the case in conservative circles in the US, and the support of the public for higher education is our most critical asset for being able to sustain ourselves in the future. Now, given these opportunities and challenges, my own positionality in the system, I'm an administrator, as Alondra mentioned, at UC Irvine, and my own personal temperament, I'm going to make comments today focusing on 3 areas, very pragmatic, to help transform the higher education system. And again, I hope these are useful and constructive. And again, they are by design grounded in things that we can do in the next 10 years to make a difference in higher education. First, I'd like to start off with talking about the importance of being attentive to change management in higher education that's necessary to accompany the demographic transition that's occurring in these institutions. Our country, our students are becoming extraordinarily more diverse. And of course, the educators, the faculty, the administrators that came of age in prior decades, much less so. And so this demographic transformation that's occurring, not just in our country, but in higher education in particular, requires great attention to the organizational culture to make sure practices are in place that support that transformation. Practices in place around hiring, promotion, mentoring, around the curriculum, climate, and support. These are this attention is required today. It's difficult, it's challenging work, but I believe there is widespread support for it. There's a recognition of the need for it in our in higher education, and I think we're going to be able to accomplish that. At UCI, I know UCI, 85% of the students at UCI are non-white, and every administrator and faculty every day thinks about these issues and works to address them. We're far from perfect. There's so much more work to be done, but it's front and center in the thinking of the institution. The second thing I want to talk about is the need for being much more intentional about serving our students and our undergraduate students in particular. Let's be clear and honest about the state of higher education in terms of student success. 40% of students that start four-year institutions in the US fail to graduate 6 years. Let me say that again, 50% of the students that start don't finish. That is a disgrace. It's unconscionable. In any other sector, we would call this a crisis and demand attention to it. We're going to hear from other panelists about it's not just that students are dropping out and failing to graduate, but there's a public health crisis, a mental health crisis in our institutions. It is unconscionable. We need to address it. And the way to address it, I believe, as a social scientist, is to be attentive to data-driven efforts to understand student experiences, student trajectories, and student outcomes. To be much careful at measuring it and to using that data to improve how we serve our students. We are the only sector in society today that doesn't use data, all the available data, to improve our services. And again, we can't afford to do that going forward in the future. Too many students are failing, and it has a disproportionate impact, of course, on non-white students and first-generation students. So again, let me give you a concrete example at UCI. At UCI, we're starting a project. I'm going to put it in the chat, a link to more information on this. At UCI, we are creating a state-of-the-art measurement system where we integrate data on student experiences, trajectories, and outcomes. And by integrating data, I mean we take advantage of all the administrative data in the system every time a student interacts with student support services, with academic advisement. We also are able to measure for every course that every student takes in the LMS system, the learning management system, whether or not they're academically engaged in that class. We survey students. We ask them about things like, are you experiencing discrimination and microaggression at UCI? We provide state-of-the-art assessments we've built with ETS that measure not just critical thinking and gains in critical thinking, but also perspective taking. Can you in a scenario take the perspective of someone different than yourself? We assess them on collaborative problem solving. Can they work together in groups with people different than themselves? So these are the kind of things we can use data to much more intentionally serve our students and ensure their success. The third and final area I believe we need to work on is we have to avoid being too insular in looking inward around the problems that we face. And again, I've trying to be honest about the significant obstacles we face internally, but it's not enough to work on ourselves. We also have to fulfill our responsibility to engage and partner with the larger community. Public universities in the US were set up with a land grant mission around public service. The nonprofit universities, they've enjoyed incredible tax benefits as well as public largesse that have created their incredible both of these institutions have an obligation not just to improve themselves so that we can better meet the needs of the 21st century, but to partner with the local communities. Let me give you two quick examples before I close. One, the pandemic in the US has thrown 20 million Americans out of work. There is an extraordinary societal need for workforce retraining to help these individuals attain labor market success in the future. Higher education institutions at this moment in time should not just be asking Congress to support them. They should be saying, how can we support society and respond to the societal needs that we are facing in our communities? We can also think in more daily activities about how our students and our grad students in particular can engage in supporting the local community. Again, at UCI, I'll give you two examples. In our public health program, the grad students are working with the county health authorities on contact tracing for the county. In education, we have our doctoral students embedded in 10 local public schools doing research practice partnerships that the local site school authorities have identified as critical to improving practice in those institutions. So we need to engage in the community partnership as well. So again, I think these are the three areas that higher education needs to transform itself. It needs to be, again, attentive to change management to address the demographic transformation that is well underway. Two, we need to engage in data-driven continuous improvement efforts to ensure student success, to be much more intentional about how we're working to support students. And third, we need to avoid being overly insular and embrace community partnerships and community engagement. And I think if we do these three things, we can create higher education institutions that are truly equitable and anti-racist in character.
Thank you very much, Richard, for getting some really important issues on the table, including the looming precarity that looms over it all. Let's turn things over to Charde Davis.
Hello, everyone. What a privilege it is to be here today, and thanks to SAGE and the Social Science Research Council for extending an invitation for us to reimagine what higher education can look like, and more specifically, how we are approaching it within our sphere of influence. Since these are just some opening remarks, I don't intend to pontificate. I just simply want to take a moment to hone in on this idea of racism in the academy. For years, the ivory tower has been outfitted to reflect the white race, white culture, white values, and white realities. And even the more liberal leaning institutions and foundations and other facets of higher education are not exempt from these critiques. But now at this moment in history, many folks are in a season of reckoning to see that after decades, centuries even of designing academia for white comfort, they inadvertently drove me and so many other Black academics away. Thus, I am reimagining the academy in Black. Let me start from this summer. On the evening of June 6, 2020, I thought of and created a hashtag called Black in the Ivory that went viral on Twitter. When I started posting my Black in the Ivory stories as an untenured Black woman faculty person, it was daunting because so many eyes were reading my tweets. My friends were reading my tweets, other Black academics around the world, former faculty in my graduate programs, university administration, including my own and national press outlets. They had access to the ugly truths that I had suppressed for so many years. Truths that folks believed I was too defensive during my dissertation defense. The irony of it all. Truths that white faculty would walk down the two-person wide hallway in the department and affix their eyes ahead so that they didn't have to acknowledge my presence, and did this on a repeated basis. Truths that 3 white women had the nerve to tell me that my discussions of racism in the United States at happy hour was too depressing and that we should change the topic. And mind you, Trayvon Martin had just been killed the day before. And truths that a white faculty advisor only wanted to meet my family at graduation for a few minutes, but sat down and had dinner with all of her other advisees' families who inadvertently were all white. There go my stories laying bare on the internet. I was incredibly exposed. Indeed, there was and still is a hypervisibility that comes along with being in this body, let alone opening my mouth to speak up and talk back, giving a nod to my sister scholar, Bell Hooks' 1989 monograph. And since then, thousands, hundreds of thousands of Black academics from around the globe have been standing in our collective right to speak truth about the racial trauma that we have experienced day in and day out within our academic workplace. While we know that there is an immense amount of work to do in higher education, we're hearing from my colleagues and fellow panelists about some of that work that needs to be done. The work on anti-Black racism specifically is a tall order. One, because it's not an easy task to uproot 400-year-old systems of white supremacy and anti-Black racism, and systems that are so intricately woven into every facet of this specific social institution. But 2, it's a tall order because there are white scholars and non-Black scholars of color who believe that focusing efforts, time, institutional resources, and national attention on anti-Black racism is an unnecessary endeavor. In fact, I have encountered a few individuals who have dangerously communicated a POC, or people of color solidarity rhetoric, to pivot the discussion away from Black-only initiatives, making clear that we should not leave out other communities of color in this work. While unity and solidarity is paramount in subverting systems of oppression, we are in systems of racism. We are in a moment where the focus should necessarily remain on Black academic experiences and needs. So what does it mean to reimagine the academy in Black? Well, first, let me just tell you, this was such an interesting exercise to think about and envision what it could look like, what I would like for it to look like. So just off the top of my head, I envision white academics stepping down and or not taking positions, new positions, because they know that there is a Black colleague who is just as, if not more qualified, and should be in that position, but was conspicuously overlooked. I envision department chairs protecting their Black women faculty persons, specifically from an inordinate amount of service that is formally recognized, but also so much of the informal service that we do that goes unnoticed. And if changes to service cannot be made, honoring the work that she does in other ways, such as merit or special merit or consideration of this work in the PTR process. I envision administrators fully leaning into this idea of equity and dedicating research funding that is specifically for Black faculty, postdocs, and graduate students. I envision directors creating events such as lunches and town halls for Black academics to network, to strategize, and to fellowship, and supporting this space with institutional dollars year after year. I also envision my white colleagues respecting our decisions to not attend the end of semester barbecue at someone's house, because we need time away from whiteness for our own self-preservation. Much of this work is outward facing, and it's been an honor to advocate for these changes at various levels at my own institution, alongside my BIPOC colleagues, as well as my CDO, president, provost, and vice presidents. And I've been doing this well before even the hashtag, so I'm happy to share more about that and the activities and the initiatives during the Q&A if folks would like to hear more. But I would be remiss if I didn't share that my heart and my passion is also really inward facing. The hashtag created this really interesting fishbowl configuration where we as Black academics were engaging in intra-community conversations in front of a sea of spectators. I'm thankful that the conversations activated something in our colleagues around the world and motivated them to take up the cause of being a co-conspirator in this work. But as I imagine the Academy in Black, I realized that Black academics, we need our own space to speak unapologetically, to seek out and distribute the hidden curriculum, the hidden curriculum that is hidden for a reason, right? It's a way of continuing to subjugate us. It's a way from keeping us from matriculating and reaching certain levels of success that, again, some of our other peers are able to achieve more easily. And a space where we can be our full selves, because I know all too well that to be a Black academic, it means that the Academy only wants a portion of me. For instance, the institution likes my drive, my grind, my dependability, and other characteristics associated with the strong Black woman controlling image, giving a nod to my other sister scholar, Patricia Hill Collins. But it doesn't want my opinions, my thoughtful critiques, and my sharp tongue. Again, giving nod to bell hooks. Fortunately, this need for our own space aligns so beautifully with my research on communication among Black women and the group dynamics within the sisterhood. And so I've been thinking a lot, taking a lot of time, quiet time, to think about this particular need and what I can do within my sphere of influence to address it. And I can just say, stay tuned, because there's more to come from me on that front. In closing, I'm humbled to have been one of many external forces that kicked open the doors for these critical conversations to occur, and hope that this kind of racial reckoning, conversations about anti-Black racism specifically, aren't done in vain. We will see in a few years if willing to walk the walk and make the decisions that are albeit unconventional, countercultural, and subversive, decisions that will make the Academy a more welcoming and inclusive space for Black academics, not only around the United States, but around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charde. Really powerful. We will turn next to Ilyas Nagdi.
Good evening, everyone, or morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I'd like to thank SSRC and SAGE for the invitation to speak today. I'll aim to keep my remarks short and hope we can have a richer discussion in the time we have remaining. So I wanted to begin with a quote that was delivered by the first president of Indonesia, Sukarno, at the closing of the 1955 Bandung Conference of the Third World Nations. So he said, "Let us remember that the highest purpose of man is the liberation of man from his bonds of fear, his bonds of human degradation, and bonds of poverty, the liberation from the physical, spiritual, and intellectual bonds which have for far too long stunted the development of humanity's majority." So that might seem like a bit of a grand statement to open on, but I'll explain as I go through. So alongside the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, and all that is going on with the world, there is no doubt that this year will be remembered for the wave of protests that occurred all across the globe. Following the emergence of this latest Black Lives Matter upsurge in the States, millions of people took to the streets across the world, reaffirming that their nations were not innocent and highlighting police brutality in their own context. Everyone, it seems, was willing to proclaim that Black Lives Matter, including those very institutions that have visited death, destruction, and deprivation upon Black and brown communities across the globe. From fast fashion producers to climate polluters, arms companies, politicians, and even closer to me, I guess, the European Parliament, which regularly allows migrants to die at its borders. I don't want to spend too much time focusing on the hypocrisy of many of these institutions, steeped as they are in the machinations of profit-making and imperialism. Instead, I want to focus on the group we are talking about today, the Academy. Now, I want to preface my comments by saying I will obviously be giving the British context, which differs to the context provided by many of my other colleagues on this panel. In Britain, the most current iteration of the Reimagining the Academy that exists has come up from student and staff collaborative campaigns initially created in 2015 from Why is My Curriculum White? In the last few years, this has transformed into decolonizing the university collectives, which have propped up across campuses, providing hubs for students and staff to consider the neoliberal marketized university and look towards transforming it. I would say that for me, decoloniality has to be a term that we develop through the course of analyzing the concrete conditions that we live in and analyzing the power relations within our own institutions of education and between our institutions and our communities and the state. In short, decoloniality should be a science towards developing a structural analysis, not just reduced to the realm of the interpersonal. One of the successes in my eyes of the earlier movements that came under this banner of decolonizing, such as the Why is My Curriculum White campaign, was to focus on the role of universities and higher education in institutionalizing power and racism, and highlighting how higher education has throughout its existence served as a vehicle for the elite to amass power. The importance of Why is My Curriculum White was to puncture the romantic notions about a supposed golden era of higher education and instead show how well before any neoliberalizing policies were brought in, higher education in Britain was a place of wealth and prestige designed to accumulate further wealth and prestige, and how many of the traditional universities of Britain drew their influence as outposts of British imperialism with their hands blooded by the slave trade and colonialism, which sister campaigns like Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford, as well as its origin in Cape Town, also made visible. For that to come to the fore, I believe it's crucial to locate movements like Why is My Curriculum White and Decolonize within the canon of recent movements in higher education, namely the struggle for free education that exploded at the turn of the decade, rather than seeing these as separate from one another or even opposed to one another. When brought together, these two struggles better illuminate the context within which universities are embedded in Britain today. Combined, they center the processes of marketization and corporatization, reshaping the university internally and the matrix of oppression that British universities are embedded in globally, accumulating and maintaining their international prestige to the detriment of institutions of the global South. In short, they shine a line on how power is concentrated vertically inside the university and how it is exerted external to the university. And from that, we understand that to decolonize at root must also mean to democratize. With that in mind, Sukarno's words mentioned at the beginning of my speech become just that much less distant and abstract. We may not be facing down the forces of imperialism, of course, but the liberation of man from the bonds of poverty then could translate over to the struggle of workers on our campuses, often Black and brown, often migrants, fighting back against the indignity of poverty pay, of outsourcing, and the ever-present threat of immigration enforcement ready to swoop in and turn their lives upside down. Liberation from intellectual bonds then could translate to the fight against our processes of knowledge production being usurped by big business and deep-pocketed profiteers as universities are thrown into the minefield of marketization. And the fact that the stature of mankind is diminished so long as nations are unfree still rings true today, especially when our institutions and higher education still traffics in fossil fuel poisoning in the global South and investments in arms trade and occupation. So in the last few years, unfortunately, what we've seen from decolonize campaigns, broadly speaking, is they've not managed to balance the countervailing forces at play in higher education. And we've seen drives towards piecemeal reform and towards the democratization of the university being subverted. University managers are now very happy to speak the language of decolonizing whilst offering the smallest crumbs of compensation to students and staff in order to keep business going as usual. For a term that was and still should evoke visions of mass campaigns by the wretched of the earth for liberation and dignity, it seems particularly troubling to hear it roll so easily off the tongue of power brokers rather than eliciting deeply uncomfortable reactions. Thankfully, heightened awareness has also been placed on processes like border controls, surveillance, and indeed military complicity, all of which occurs within higher education. How can we speak about an anti-racist university when bordering and deportations designate worthy and unworthy members of our education community? How can an anti-racist institution surveil, police, and profile its staff and students? How can a decolonial or anti-racist institution exist if it sustains polluters fueling the climate crisis or the arms trade? So my idea for this reimagining the higher education conversation that we're having today is the one that we've seen be the most visionary and promising in campuses here, which is that brought forward by student and staff collectives to democratize their institutions and transform them in such a way that we break from business models and strategies towards building community and collectives, where teaching and pedagogy are more to do with cultivating knowledge production as a collective and for the collective good. So I'll end my initial remarks there. And yeah, thank you again for the invitation. I look forward to the conversation.
It'll be a great conversation. Thank you very much, Ilyas. And we'll turn next to Noliwe Rooks.
Hi, thank you all. This was amazing to listen to. I'm really looking forward to our having a chance to kind of engage, and thank you, Alondra, and your staff for putting this together, making us all feel so welcome. I think, in the interest of time, I'm actually just going to kind of narrate my points. I have two main areas that I want to look at and to think about. And as I was putting my remarks together, I actually did write out remarks. I had that experience that I think some of us have sometime where there was a soundtrack in the back of my head. Perhaps that is just me. Perhaps I should not assume that other people have soundtracks in their head. But as I was putting this one together, what's love got to do with it just kept cycling for me. The idea and the incongruity of the ways that we think about these institutions that we work in, that we send our children to, that we teach in, that we think about, the incongruity of thinking about love as central to that work. There's something that for at least academics of color, I know, people will tell you regularly, these institutions don't love you. Do not make the mistake of believing that your devotion, your time and your effort will necessarily result in love coming back at you. But as I was focused on two main areas, which have to do with the unequal degree attainment, mostly for Black students. Most of my work is about the education of Black people in the United States from Reconstruction forward. And a lot of it recently is really about the unfinished work and the unfinished meaning and the processes of integration. In K through 12, we've really grappled with integrating our institutions in various ways. We have largely failed. That's a whole other conversation. However, there have been court cases, there are novels, there's data sets, like, you know, we think about what it means and why we have not succeeded at integration in K through 12. That's not a conversation that we have very often in higher education. We have it in the moments following protests, generally in the moments following police murders, over the years, from the 1960s on college campuses, what happens in communities having to do with power and death and disenfranchisement makes their way under higher education. And there are these moments where we kind of say, how can we treat people well who are here? How can we address the demands that they're making, those who are here? Absent that, it's not clear. We're spending a lot of time on that. So that's one thing that I'm gonna just throw out some, what I call data points. Other people call stories, I call them data points around that. And then the second thing is really to take seriously how often Black people and Black students and students of color on our campuses tell us that they're in pain, tell us that they're struggling. Tell us in ways that are clinical, right? I'm not attempting to pathologize students or Black people in predominantly white spaces, but they tell us in ways that are clinical how many days a month they can't get out of bed, how many days a month they feel like they cannot go on, how often it is that they feel like they've given everything that they can, often at the expense of their schoolwork, to try to make these campuses some place that they can survive, but also that they can feel good about having others behind them come to. And they're spending a lot of time on it, and it's the same kind of thing. So those are my two big things. And the big question again, soundtrack, what's love got to do with it? Does an ethic of love, how do we define it? Is diversity, is inclusion, is belonging actually dancing around something else that we would do well to pay attention to? Something more fundamental than do you belong? Do I have an ethic of care that I could call love? So the first really just has to do with always wanting to raise the ways that structural inequality impact who even shows up on predominantly white campuses. So I'm a graduate of an HBCU. That's a different undergraduate undergrad. That's a different conversation that at this moment, I'm not going to weave through. Maybe in some of our Q&A, we can talk some about what we give up and what we get when we enter predominantly white spaces, what we willingly, voluntarily give up for the promises that are out there. But for predominantly white colleges and universities, there's about 4,400 in the United States. And what I want you to think about is the fact that 80% of white students in the United States attend the top 480 schools, roughly, about 480 schools. The most wealthy of that 80% attend the top 20 or so schools, right? So these spaces are predominantly white. They're raced. These spaces are raced in ways that have to do with where institutions recruit from, the kinds of standardized tests that serve as gatekeeping mechanisms, that have geographical issues, that have to do with what kind of faculty you're inviting people to come work with. There's a raced component. 70 to 75% of Black and Latinx students go to community colleges, for-profit schools, or open admission schools. So even if going to four-year institutions, they're going to the institutions that basically, if you can scrape together the money to apply, you will go. We tend to just talk about college attainment and getting a degree in some communities as the goal in itself, just some degree, some college. And not all communities understand equally the divisions between the kind of degree that you're getting and the doors that get opened. So for that top 20 colleges, top 480 to 500 schools, you in fact, especially for children of color who, if they get in, for poor kids, for immigrant kids, for first generation kids, if you're going to the top schools, you actually graduate with less debt, you graduate getting better jobs, you graduate on time, pretty much. There's a payoff for coming to those campuses, but a lot of those campuses are holding steady at 5 to 6% Black and Latinx enrollment. They let in a certain amount. You almost have to work hard, I think, to be so consistent at that number for so long, right between 5 and 6%, that have the opportunity for those kinds of, that kind of education. And the amounts of money spent on instruction in those schools is also raised and classed in those same kinds of ways, from a low of $6,000 per student at the most open access kinds of schools to about $27,000 per student at the top 80 schools, about $27,000. I want to say a lot of my work is in K through 12 education, and I want to point out that that also kind of mirrors under-resourced public schools versus going to top tier schools. So what we have in the United States for children primarily educated in the United States is an under-resourced education from K through 12 that carries over into higher education. And I don't think that we spend enough time connecting the two. We just talk about work your way to higher education without, I think, paying the attention that we should and could to how it is that one gets from one to the other. So that's one thing, that's one point, that's my one, what I would call a data point. Schools are not equal. And the degrees as a result that Black children, poor children, Latinx children, Indigenous children are getting are simply unequal. Now, then if you get to these elite schools, these well-resourced schools, these life-changing schools, these schools that will make a generational difference for you and yours, a degree from some of these schools literally will change the trajectory of your family. It's real. But when you get there, this is where you start to hear the stories of the stories that students on campuses like those that I teach on, and I have enough of a relationship with enough students to know that part of the survival is telling those who come in, just get your armor up when you have to take certain professors. They're just racist. They're just transphobic. They're just not going to change. They're old and set in their ways. They're well connected. People protect them. Just, you're not gonna, if they're not grading on a curve, don't take that class. If you look at their labs, they never have any people who look like you in them. They're not training a generation of scientists, those people who look like you. So the hidden curriculum that Dr. Davis talked about, that our students are teaching those who come after them, has to do with not expecting a certain kind of treatment, but learning how to accept those wounds, to accept those kinds of wounds, that kind of exclusion as a necessary prerequisite for your getting this education. And an institution that will consistently tell you, just don't take classes with them, or we're trying. It should surprise no one that if from the 1960s on, if you look, one of the main asks that student protesters consistently make, is for mental health professionals, consistently. And we focus a lot in higher education on cluster hires and people who are going to study race and inequality, and faculty hires, and students ask for that as well. There are very few public protests that students don't ask for more faculty who are teaching things that are relevant. And again, since the 60s, we don't so much use relevant anymore, but teach things that are going to help them understand racism in the United States. If you look at most of those reports, they're also saying we need some help with surviving these institutions. And what is it? I don't know how much more forcefully they can ask. I don't know how much more often they need to ask to say that these institutions are not in their best interest. These institutions are causing mental health issues. These institutions can ask you to push down your humanity in order to survive them. And to be clear, there's some students who think that's great. There's some people who think that the dog eat dog, bring it on, competition, I want to stand at the top of the heap, whatever it is, the fire I have to walk through, I'm gonna walk through it and feel good at the end. There are some for whom the conditions of success make them feel great, but there's a whole bunch who are suffering. And so my two big, what should we do? What can we do to reimagine our institutions? One, to take a cold hard look at how difficult it is for so many to get into our institutions, to take a good look at the 2, 3, 4 tier tracks of education that we have. That's something that Bob Moses used to call sharecropper education, as a part of the 1964 Freedom Summer. But how much of our educational practices are bound by a kind of caste sensibility. We are educating people to certain roles. And to the extent that our institutions that we teach at are implicated in that, I'm saying we need to actually take a look at that and either say we are here for the ways that we are stratifying the United States based on education. We're just here for that. That's okay. You know, it may make us feel kind of queasy to say it, but that's just the world, or figure out how to change it. The second thing is to ask ourselves if these institutions, if there's anything about higher education that makes an ethic of love relevant. That's what I got.
Thank you so much. So the Q&A has been very active. There's lots of questions. I'm going to try to start by kind of synthesizing a couple, what I take to be kind of 2 issues that are raised, that we'll go to all of you, starting with Richard. And I guess the question, I would phrase it this way: the double-edged sword of community and of data. So each of you in your own way, I think, raised community. Richard was, I guess I want to sort of also bring into our conversation the great Nancy Cantor, who is the chancellor of Rutgers Newark, who talks about the university as this third space, as, you know, this kind of necessary anchor. We know in some of our communities, the university is, or universities in a place like New York City, is one of the top employers in the entire city or an entire region. So they're part of the community in that way. Noliwe posed to us, and Charde sort of similarly, the sort of cost of what people have to give up to enter community of higher education. Charde also posed to us that sometimes people need separate spaces of community or don't need to be mandated to come into community in ways that make it hard for them to do their work. Ilyas brought for us an idea of community as being liberatory. So he counterposed a business model of higher education that was constraining, and then sort of pointed to a kind of communities and coalitions as a model for a more liberatory higher education. And then, of course, Noliwe ends with this invocation of love and an ethic of care, which I'm so inspired by, that of course implicates community, right? You know, what people care for each other, that is necessarily a relational kind of community ethic. So I wanted to start there, and then starting, spurred by Richard, the other double-edged sword, but I think all of us can weigh in on it, is about data. And there's a particular question from Heather Talmadge in the Q&A, which is, who has access to the data? How do we think about the data? Data arguably creates some of the inequalities we see if we think about standardized testing and the kind of whole, there's a whole longevity about data in higher education. And so how do we think about who has access to the data, trust between administrators and students with regards to acquiring the data, analyzing the data, and the like. So again, sort of community and data as solutions, but also as potential problems and as sort of double-edged swords that we might want to think through, starting with Richard.
Great, thank you. A lot there, Alondra. I'll try to respond. So starting with the data, I think it's important for students and faculty to be involved in this activity. So at UCI, the Undergraduate Student Senate, it formally endorsed the project as useful and important for the institution to engage in. To better serve students. In terms of access to data, I follow the social science principle of open science, and so I believe data should be de-identified so individuals' privacy rights are protected, and then deposited in an entity like at the University of Michigan's ICPSR, so that faculty, students, researchers have access to better understanding that data and the social institutions that they inhabit. And another thing that really came up in this panel is this real tension. And tension is something, is a term I learned from the last president, Ira Katz-Nelson at SSRC. When I worked with him, he was always talking about tensions, and this tension between the oppressive character of higher education and the liberatory character of higher education. And they're both, it's both. And so capturing that reality, that tension, but then working to make sure that it is more liberatory in character than oppressive. And I was just going to end in kind of, and I think we can use data to try and figure out that puzzle. And I was going to end with this kind of around this public, this mental health crisis, because it's really, every time I we talk about the reality of what students and faculty are facing in these institutions, I'm struck by the moment we're in right now, where so many of our institutions are operating remotely. And isn't it an interesting opportunity to understand how students are faring with remote instruction in terms of their mental health? I mean, it's during a pandemic where communities are impacted and people are facing all sorts of stress and tension that has nothing to do with higher education itself. But isn't this an interesting opportunity to also study what it means to separate kind of the residential piece of higher education experience that, again, is both oppressive and liberatory in character, to strip that away for a moment and see how students are progressing. And what's interesting at UCI is it appears that the attrition rates are lower, students' GPAs are higher, and credit accumulations are higher. Students are, in terms of their traditional measures of academic progress, are remarkably doing extraordinarily well during these challenging times. And I think we really need to understand why, and then use that knowledge to help us improve how we're serving them when the pandemic is over.
Thank you. Charde?
When I think about this idea of data, and kind of going back to some conversations I've had recently with some of my sister scholar collaborators about epistemic exclusion. Data, research, social scientific approaches, some might consider to be kind of the gold standard, right? Thinking about surveys, for example, and again, kind of more even quantitative methods. And so when certain kind of data is yielded, people, how do I say, again, I think of it as a gold standard, right? They think of it as kind of objective, and making sure that with any decisions that are made, that it is supported by that particular set of data. But I think about two sociologists, White Logic, White Methods book about racism and methodology, about the way in which we approach research, the way in which we are kind of gathering this data, thinking about research. There are certain individuals, again, thinking about myself as a Black academic, someone who is not only Black, but also studies Black individuals, to where I am at wholesale, at the onset, kind of excluded from this enterprise. And I think that it is worth having deeper conversations about what that means. Again, thinking about the book, White Logic, White Methods, about how there is, and them advocating for a serious overhaul when it comes to social science and social science research. But I think that is, again, another tall order. There are certain individuals who, of course, are benefiting from the way in which we do research, and certain narratives that get privileged and normed. Certain individuals whose success is predicated on the way in which we, again, go about doing our work. And so it is, again, beneficial for certain individuals to kind of reify these structures. But that's the phrase that kind of came to my mind when thinking about data. Certainly, there are, of course, discussions about data and its release and who owns the data, right, within the kind of university setting and administration. But again, as a Black woman who's a Black feminist scholar, who is also, of course, a communications scholar, and kind of sits at the intersection of these two seemingly kind of, I don't want to say contradictory, but two kind of fields or areas of work that have not historically been in conversation with one another, and theories and methods that have, of course, have not been in conversation with one another. I find myself towing this line of feeling as though the discipline is not ready for me and other scholars like myself to again be engage in critical discussions about how we and our work and the communities that we study, how we are, again, excluded at the onset. So I think about this from a more kind of my own vantage point as a researcher, and data in that way.
Ilyas, thank you.
It's interesting because when so what I was thinking around when you raised the question of data and community is how quite often data is used as a tactic for inaction, was probably the first thing that sort of came to mind. And the reason I say that is that the experiences and outcomes of racialized students in education has been a discussion for as long as there have been racialized students in higher education. But conversations on race and racial injustice often end up rerouted into conversations on diversity or relegated to research reports, having little impact on the lives of students at the sharp end. And through it all, racialized students and staff end up becoming an object of examination in our institutions, almost forever living under the microscope, rather than being considered part of this community worth engaging with as equals. They're seen as a problem population. And this was a large part of what fueled strategies and thinking around tackling racial inequality in universities in the UK up until a few years ago, where deficit model approaches were taken to almost every strategy to tackle inequality. And the reason I raised the point of data in particular is because I think it's one where increasingly over the last few years, we've begun to see universities respond in part to the demands for change, including collective demands for change from members of the community around campus and from members of the community within campus, through setting up commissions, through setting up inquiries and different sort of bodies to look into things. And that has, again, just been recycled this year as another sort of data gathering exercise. And we see this, like, in particular, I don't know how many of the attendees may be from the United Kingdom, but just today, the British government announced that it is engaging in a large equalities data gathering exercise to tackle racial inequality in the UK. This will complement the Commission to Tackle Racial Inequality, which is gathering data, which was set up in June, also to complement the data gathering exercises, which were set up in February, and the Race Equality Audit Office, which was set up 2 years ago to gather data across government departments. So it's almost like becoming like an endless churning out of data collection as a delaying tactic to actually just taking action, which is probably the most urgent thing to do today.
Thank you. Noliwe?
So I was thinking about this question of data and community. And so I think I said I've been working in race and education in the US for some time. The last book that I wrote is about segregation and integration. And I, without thinking, would go to community gatherings. This book, unlike my other three, I spent more time talking to people in churches, in living rooms, in schools than I did in auditoriums. And I spent far more time talking to the subjects of my book, to parents, grandparents, students, than is usually the case. You know, usually I just get to kind of pontificate, and these people are kind of like, that don't sound like my experience. So the reason I bring that up is it became clear that for many of these communities, data in the service of the policies that have to do with education for them is something that's amassed to do something to them against their will, as opposed to for them. The idea that we're going to collect more information in the kind of community narratives that I found myself engaged with really was so, in their minds, so that you can then justify continuing to do these things that nobody ever asked you to do for them. So one example would be when I wrote this book and was talking to people and was sort of like, so, you know, data show that this truism that I didn't even think was anything to defend, that educational integration is almost an uncomplicated good for attainment, for future earnings. It's certainly one of the big civil rights wins. And we're all, you know, we all believe in integration. And there's just reams of scholarship, reams of data to support that from different fields. And I consistently got pushback from folks in these communities saying, but what about the cost to my kid when I send them to those schools? What about, like, what is that data telling you? And this big push that all this data is telling you to have my kid never have a Black teacher, basically, because the models for the ways that we want to pursue integration, the ways that we want to enact it in my community means they have to go get on a bus and go to a school where there's no break. And I kept hearing this, and at least initially I was kind of like, no, like you're not, like you're just kind of misunderstanding. Like, you know, you cannot. And then I started wondering, why do I keep having the same conversations, like all over the country? Why do I keep having the same conversations with Black and Latinx parents and grandparents and caregivers and foster mothers? And why am I in this uncomfortable position of telling them that their experience is just wrong, or what they think is just not supported, that they're out of step with what my reams of data is showing. And that made me take a step back, right? And really think about, is it the data, or is it a way of bridging the space between what questions have been asked, what data sets have been pulled together, and that step of then figuring out what the impact is on the subjects that have been studied, not the impact for the researcher, who in conversation with other researchers continues to confirm that they're on the right track. But at what point is there a kind of off-ramp to say, all right, is this actually doing what we think it's supposed to do? And so the work I'm doing now is trying to figure out how can we take better care of that impact piece, and of making sure that what we're doing, to the extent that what we're doing is anti-racist, in the service of justice, in the service of realigning the world to be more just, how do we check in from time to time to make sure that the people who we think we're helping have that same kind of view?
Thank you. So I'm mindful of time, but let me pose two questions and you can answer one of them if you don't mind, somewhat concisely, given that we're a little bit out of time, but just to bring us back to the central issues here. So one, what advice would you give to students and staff who are putting an effort to address inequality within their institutions, but are faced with walls of bureaucracy and staff within higher positions who view movements such as decolonizing the curriculum as unnecessary? And then second, and feel free to choose one, I began a Black faculty group in our college, but Black faculty refused assistance from the institution to keep their voices pure and unchecked. Do you believe or envision an institution-supported affinity group for Black academics can be, I think, efficacious? Richard?
Yeah, I'll take on the first one. So what do you see to people who are frustrated by the slow pace of change in doing this work? You're right to be frustrated. We should be moving quicker. The challenge is organizational change, particularly to focuses on organizational culture. We know in all organizations, and regardless of the issue, is very, very difficult. In fact, there's a lot of organizational theory that suggests organizational cultures really don't change. You have to kind of replace the old organization with new organizations. So this is hard, difficult work, particularly around the issue of culture and practices. I would remind people that there is a demographic transformation underway. And so things are changing. You have a right to be frustrated. We have to do better. We have to work harder. Have hope and keep in mind, going back to Dr. Rooks about the ethic of love. Keep in your hearts kind of the tension between oppression and liberation that is at the core of these institutions, and stay hopeful for the future.
Thank you. Charde?
The second question really resonated with me, especially because I've been doing this work at UConn with creating our own affinity groups, town halls, councils, and we've had really critical conversations about how our entity and its relationship or not with the university. I can say that Absolutely. Think that, and I very much respect my colleagues, right, general colleagues at this institution, to say that they don't want university resources. And I think that from a university and perhaps administrator's perspective, I think that's part of being a co-conspirator in this work, is respecting the decision of the community and what that they feel as though they, or they know that they need in that moment. I'm not quite sure who wrote this question, and perhaps it at least came off to me as though it might be someone on the kind of university administrator end. But my thoughts are to continue to respect that decision. I don't think that respect that decision. I think that with any university and any particular Black faculty entity, it's going to vary from university to university, right? So in terms of university kind of having or giving institutional resources to these groups, I do believe generally that that there should be some institutional resources for these spaces. But if the faculty are saying that at this moment they don't want it, that doesn't mean that the university can't earmark it, right? That in their budget. That doesn't mean that that money they can't find a way for it to roll over in the future. That also doesn't mean that that the university can engage in conversations with these faculty to say, it seems as though you all don't want these resources for your group, but can you envision how we might be able to use these resources for other Black folks across the campus, right? But again, that requires engaging in a respect and engaging in conversations where the university is willing and able to take a cue from this Black faculty group.
Thank you, Charde. That's good advice for lots of things around resources at our institutions. Ilyas, please.
I'll keep this short. So I guess like in reference to, so I've just sort of combined the two in my mind in terms of thinking about answering them. So I think there is a danger when we talk about being connected to the academy of co-option, which we've seen in the past, including like the watering down of demands and sort of the piecemeal reform. However, that can be countered by building like models of decision-making built around community consensus, rather than sort of the models of decision-making that we've traditionally seen. And in reference to the first question around decolonizing, like our work needs to be uncomfortable and challenging. It's fine if there's senior cynics in your institution who think our work is unnecessary or obstructive or going too far. You know, these are the exact same thing that's been said about every movement in the past. Our role isn't and shouldn't be to spend far too much time winning over all the senior cynics, but rather to build from the mass, you know, to build from and connect the struggles of the precarious migrant workers to the students and beyond, so that we can hold the institution's feet to the fire to demand the change that we want in reimagining the academy.
Thank you. Noliwe.
So really quickly, because I know we're almost out of time, I would just raise up the saying that people have that budgets are ideological roadmaps. They're ideological documents. And we do well to make sure that some of support for some of what we would like to see support for is a part of budget. So can tenure reviews take into account certain kind of work that certain faculty are already overburdened with? Is there some reason that if you have 29,000, this is a made up number, you know, 29 gazillion million advisees, because you're one of two Black faculty and all the Black students or Latinx students are running to you, is there a way, why can't that kind of service actually be rewarded? It's not keeping any of the other faculty from reaching out and doing more of it, which is generally the thing. Like, well, I, you know, am not doing all that kind of advice. Nothing is stopping you from doing that, but budgets are ideological documents. And so we know what institutions support when we see what they fund. And that's always, I think, the battle to make sure that you're a line item, to make sure that what you support is in the budget and hopefully endowed so it's in there in perpetuity. In the absence of that, I think all of this, I think the reason we see all these cyclical calls cyclical hiring, like the thing, but like how time is so liminal in these conversations, we keep seeing the same demands and the same responses, is people just sort of wait you out. So you have to be in the budget, you have to have something that needs to be dismantled, at least if administration moves on, if winds change. You have to still be able to do your work, and there's precious few ways to ensure that on these campuses. And I think we need to pay more attention to the ways that happens.
Thank you all so much. Ziad, any last words from you?
Just a huge thank you for everyone, their contributions, and to say that universities reforming themselves from within is one thing, but one could also look to allies and partners of various kinds acting, putting pressure on universities too. And I would just strongly put in a word for Leading Roots, a British-based organisation who are looking at Black in academia all the way from access through to add a data point, only 150 Black professors out of 40,000 in the UK. And so there's a whole network of workers, and one of the questions who says, is there any hope? I think there absolutely is, and I've really loved this conversation.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Richard Arum. Thank you, Charde Davis. Thank you, Ilya Nagdi, and thank you, Noluwe Rooks, for really sparking an important conversation today. The Q&A is full of questions. There's lots more to be said. We'll capture some of this and circulate it. But we're so grateful for really your leadership in the spaces in which you do your work, and for helping us to have this conversation today. Thank you to Ziad and our colleagues at Sage Publishing for their partnership, particularly Lou Cody, Lena Ashore, Katie Metzler, and also to Rajat Singh and Veena Tran of the SSRC team. Video of this panel will be available on the Sage Social Science Space site and also on the SSRC's Inequality Initiative site. And we invite you to follow the work there. Thank you all so much. And I look forward to continuing the conversation in other modalities. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.